The body camera footage would later show exactly what happened that Saturday afternoon at 2:47 p.m. on May 18, 2024, at Driftwood Beach in Charleston County, South Carolina. A black woman in her early 50s sat on a beach towel under a large striped umbrella reading a book. She wore a navy blue one-piece swimsuit and oversized sunglasses. Her beach bag sat beside her with a water bottle, sunscreen, and a paperback novel clearly visible. Federal agents Marcus Webb and Jennifer Kowalski spotted her from their patrol vehicle parked near the public access point, and something in Webb's expression changed. He pointed toward the woman, said something to Kowalski, and they both started walking across the sand with purpose. Webb's hand moved to his belt, his jaw already tight. What these federal agents didn't know was that they had just made the worst mistake of their entire careers. One decision that would cost them their badges, trigger a Department of Justice investigation, expose a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long, and ultimately result in a settlement worth $29.7 million. The cameras were rolling, multiple witnesses had their phones out, and Marcus Webb was about to destroy everything he had built over 17 years of service while teaching a lesson that would echo through federal law enforcement agencies across the entire country. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. This story gets even more intense, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Judge Patricia Morrison had been a federal judge for the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina for 11 years. Before that, she spent 14 years as a federal prosecutor, building cases against organized crime syndicates, corrupt officials, and major drug trafficking operations. She had prosecuted cases that put away some of the most dangerous criminals on the East Coast: international money launderers, human traffickers, and violent gang leaders. She knew the law inside and out. She knew her constitutional rights better than most lawyers, and she definitely knew when those rights were being violated. She was the kind of person who mentored young attorneys, volunteered at legal aid clinics on weekends, and had received the South Carolina Bar Association's Distinguished Service Award 3 years running. She carried herself with quiet confidence earned through decades of excellence. Nothing about her screamed confrontation or invited conflict. She was simply a dedicated public servant who had spent her entire career fighting for justice. That Saturday afternoon, Patricia had one simple goal: enjoy a few hours of peace at her favorite beach before preparing for a major trial starting Monday morning. She had driven 40 minutes from her home in Charleston, parked in the public lot, walked down the wooden boardwalk carrying her beach chair and umbrella, and found a quiet spot away from the families with small children. She spread out her towel, opened her book, and settled in for some much-needed relaxation. Simple, normal, forgettable. She was taking a break before presiding over a federal civil rights case, a case involving allegations of racial profiling and excessive force by law enforcement officers. The irony of what was about to happen to her would not be lost on anyone who heard this story later. Federal agent Marcus Webb approached her location with agent Jennifer Kowalski following 2 steps behind. Webb was a 17-year veteran of the Federal Protective Service responsible for security at federal facilities and properties in the region. His hand rested on his belt, his shoulders squared, his walk deliberate. He didn't greet Patricia or explain his presence. Instead, he stood directly in front of her, blocking her son, and made his demand. Patricia looked up from her book, confused but calm. She removed her sunglasses and asked if there was a problem. Webb told her she was on restricted federal property and needed to leave immediately. Patricia glanced around at the crowded beach. Families were playing in the waves. A group of teenagers played volleyball 50 yards away. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along the waterline. She pointed out that this was a public beach and asked what made it restricted. Webb didn't really answer. Instead, he asked her how she got onto the beach. She told him the truth. She parked in the public parking lot, walked down the public access boardwalk, and set up her towel on the public beach, the same way she had done dozens of times over the past 5 years. He asked to see her identification. Patricia paused, her legal training kicking in immediately. She asked him on what legal grounds he was requesting her identification, given that she was engaged in a completely legal activity in a public space. Webb's jaw tightened. He repeated his demand, this time with his voice harder, louder. He needed to see ID, now. Patricia reached into her beach bag slowly, keeping her movements visible and deliberate. She pulled out her wallet and handed him her driver's license. Webb studied it for a long time, much longer than necessary, holding it up to the sunlight as if checking for forgery. Around them, other beachgoers continued their activities without interference. A white family with 3 children had set up an elaborate tent and cooler system 20 feet away. Nobody asked them for identification. A group of college-age white men tossed a football, their music playing from a portable speaker. Webb and Kowalski walked right past them without a second glance. 2 white women in their 60s sat in beach chairs reading, their belongings spread across a wide area. No questions asked. Patricia noticed this. She had trained herself to notice everything. It was part of her job. As a federal judge, she observed behavior, assessed credibility, and recognized patterns. And the pattern here was crystal clear. Then Webb asked the question that told Patricia everything she needed to know about why she had been targeted. "What are you doing in this area? Where are you really from?" The implication hung in the air like an accusation. The meaning was crystal clear and absolutely disgusting. He was questioning whether a black woman belonged on this particular beach in this particular county. Patricia kept her voice calm and steady. She informed Agent Webb that she was a Charleston resident, that this was a public beach, and that she had every legal right to be here. She asked him to explain the specific statute or regulation that prohibited her presence. Webb didn't provide one. Instead, he told her to pack up her belongings and leave, or he would cite her for trespassing on federal property. Patricia remained seated on her towel. She calmly stated that she would not be leaving, as she was not trespassing. She asked for his badge number and the name of his supervisor. This request seemed to infuriate Webb. His face flushed red. He told her that refusing to comply with a lawful order was obstruction of justice. Patricia calmly informed him that an order could not be lawful if it violated her constitutional rights. She was not obstructing anything. She was exercising her right to use a public beach. Agent Kowalski shifted uncomfortably, looking between Webb and Patricia with growing concern. Webb stepped closer, invading Patricia's personal space. He stood directly over her, using his height and position to intimidate. He told her this was her final warning. Patricia pulled out her cell phone and started recording. She held it up clearly, making sure the camera captured both of their faces. The moment that camera came out, something shifted. Webb's voice got louder, his aggression more pronounced. He demanded she stop recording immediately, claiming she was interfering with a federal investigation. Patricia calmly stated that she had the absolute right to record a federal officer performing their duties in a public space. She cited the specific case law, Glick v. Cuniff, First Circuit Court of Appeals, 2011. This was his second massive mistake, and the consequences were already piling up. People were starting to notice now. A woman in her 30s stopped jogging and pulled out her phone, starting to film from about 30 feet away. An older black couple sitting nearby turned to watch, their faces showing recognition of what was happening. A white man with 2 young children moved his family's setup further down the beach but kept glancing back toward the confrontation. Webb called for backup on his radio, his voice clipped and aggressive. He reported a hostile individual refusing to comply with lawful orders and interfering with federal officers. Patricia sat perfectly still on her towel, phone steady in her hand, recording everything. Quick question for you all. Have you or someone you know ever experienced something like this? Type yes if you have. Agent Kowalski quietly suggested to Webb that maybe they should call a supervisor. Her body language showed clear discomfort. She had taken 2 steps back from the confrontation, her hands at her sides rather than on her belt. She could see this situation spiraling out of control. Webb ignored her. He was committed now, his pride overriding his judgment. He demanded Patricia stand up and produce additional identification proving she had authorization to be on the beach. Patricia responded that she needed no special authorization to use a public beach, and she would not be standing up or providing anything further without a clear legal justification for this detention. "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" she asked clearly for the camera. Webb's response was immediate. "You're being detained for trespassing and obstruction." "On what probable cause?" Patricia asked. Webb had no good answer. He just repeated that she was detained and needed to comply with his orders. This was his 3rd massive mistake. More phones came out. A group of teenagers had stopped their volleyball game to watch and record. The woman who had been jogging was now filming from multiple angles. A man in a proud Navy veteran t-shirt stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disgust as he watched. Patricia remained seated, her book still open beside her, her composure absolute. But inside she was documenting everything: the time, the statements made, the lack of legal justification, the clear racial profiling. Every word would matter when this inevitably went to court. 2 additional federal agents arrived within 6 minutes, Agents Derek Hansen and Maria Santos. Webb immediately gave them his version of events, describing Patricia as uncooperative and potentially dangerous, claiming she had refused multiple lawful orders and was trespassing on restricted federal property. But when they looked at the scene, something didn't add up. Santos was experienced enough to spot problems immediately. She glanced at the crowded public beach, the families everywhere, the complete absence of any restricted area signage. She asked Webb the obvious question: what specific federal property was being restricted, and under what authority? Webb's answer was vague and contradictory. He claimed the entire beach fell under federal jurisdiction for security purposes. That answer did not satisfy Santos at all. She knew the local beaches. She knew that Driftwood Beach was public property, maintained by the county, with no federal restrictions except for a small area near a Coast Guard station that was clearly marked and nearly a mile north of their current location. Santos looked at Hansen. The look they exchanged said everything. They both knew this stop had gone completely wrong. Patricia, still recording, calmly stated her full name and title for the camera. "My name is Patricia Elizabeth Morrison. I am a United States federal judge for the District of South Carolina. I have been unlawfully detained by federal agent Marcus Webb while lawfully using a public beach. I have repeatedly asked for the legal justification for this detention and have been provided none." All four agents froze. Webb's face went from red to pale in about 2 seconds. Kowalski took an involuntary step backward. "Do you think Webb actually believed she was trespassing, or did he know exactly what he was doing? Let me know in the comments." Santos immediately stepped forward. She asked Patricia if she had identification that could verify her position. Patricia calmly stated that her judicial credentials were in her car in the parking lot, but she would be happy to provide them if she was allowed to retrieve them without being arrested. She also suggested they could call the courthouse and verify her identity through the clerk's office. Webb, instead of immediately apologizing and de-escalating, made it worse. He told Santos that anyone could claim to be a judge and that they should proceed with the detention until her identity was verified. This was his fourth catastrophic mistake. Santos pulled out her phone and called the courthouse directly. She spoke to the weekend security officer, provided Patricia's name, and requested verification. Within 90 seconds, the security officer confirmed that Judge Patricia Morrison was indeed a sitting federal judge, that she matched the physical description Santos provided, and that she was scheduled to preside over a major civil rights trial beginning Monday morning. The crowd of witnesses had grown to about 20 people. At least 8 phones were recording. The woman in her 30s who had been jogging was now live streaming to Facebook, where the video was already being shared. Everyone was watching Webb's career implode in real time. The phone conversation with courthouse security was on speaker. Everyone heard the confirmation. Webb stood frozen, still holding Patricia's driver's license in his hand. For a long moment he just stood there as the reality of what he had done started to sink in. He had illegally detained a federal judge. He had accused her of trespassing on public property with no legal basis. He had threatened her with arrest for exercising her constitutional rights. He had filed a false report claiming she was hostile and uncooperative when the video evidence clearly showed she had been calm and legally informed from the very first moment. And all of it was recorded on multiple cameras from multiple angles. His career was over, and somewhere in his mind, Webb had to know it. But instead of immediately apologizing and trying to salvage the situation, Webb made it worse. He examined Patricia's license more closely, as if he still suspected it might be fake. He asked why she hadn't identified herself as a federal judge immediately, attempting to shift blame onto her for his own misconduct. Every word out of his mouth just dug the hole deeper. Santos had seen enough. She walked over, gently took Patricia's license from Webb's hand, and returned it to her with a quiet apology. She asked if Patricia needed medical attention or any other assistance. Patricia remained seated on her towel, book still beside her, composure absolute. She thanked Santos but declined medical attention. She did, however, request all 4 agents' badge numbers, their full names, and the name of their immediate supervisor. She also requested copies of all body camera footage and dispatch recordings from the incident. She was building a case, and Webb could only stand there and watch it happen. Patricia took photographs of all 4 agents with her phone, clearly documenting their faces and badge numbers. She collected contact information from 7 witnesses who volunteered to provide statements. She noted the exact time the detention began and ended, 2:47 p.m. to 3:23 p.m., 36 minutes of illegal detention. She asked Santos if she was now free to go or if they intended to continue the unlawful detention. Santos immediately confirmed she was free to go and apologized again on behalf of the Federal Protective Service. Patricia gathered her belongings slowly and deliberately. She folded her towel, collapsed her umbrella, packed her beach bag. The crowd watched in complete silence, the weight of what they had witnessed hanging heavy in the air. Before she left, Patricia looked directly at Webb and spoke clearly for all the cameras. "Agent Webb, you will be hearing from me formally. What you did here today was not just wrong, it was a violation of my constitutional rights and a clear example of racial profiling. I will be filing an official complaint and I will be pursuing this matter to its fullest extent." Webb said nothing. His face had gone completely pale. His hands were shaking. Patricia walked back to her car with her head held high, her dignity intact, while Webb stood on the beach surrounded by witnesses who had documented his complete professional destruction. The videos hit the internet within 2 hours. The woman who had been live streaming to Facebook had captured nearly the entire encounter, and her video was shared 47,000 times before midnight. By Sunday morning, it had 2.3 million views. Local news picked up the story immediately. By Sunday afternoon, it was national news. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all ran segments. "Federal judge illegally detained while sunbathing" became the headline that dominated the news cycle for 3 straight days. The optics couldn't have been worse for the Federal Protective Service or the Department of Homeland Security, which oversaw the agency. Type "accountability" in the comments if you think Webb got exactly what he deserved. Webb's history came out quickly after that. Journalists and legal advocates subpoenaed his personnel file within 48 hours. Turned out he had 19 previous complaints for inappropriate conduct. 19. 15 involved interactions with people of color. 12 specifically involved Black individuals being questioned or detained in public spaces where white people were not similarly questioned. In 2019, he detained a Black college professor for suspicious behavior while the professor was birdwatching in a public park. The complaint was dismissed after mandatory cultural sensitivity training. In 2021, he questioned a Black family having a picnic at a federal monument, demanding proof they had permission to be there, while white families nearby were not questioned. The complaint resulted in a written reprimand that was removed from his file after 6 months. In 2022, he stopped a Black businessman trying to enter a federal building, insisting his credentials were fake, despite the man working in that building for 7 years. The complaint was settled internally with no public disclosure. The Federal Protective Service had flagged some incidents for additional training. Webb had been counseled multiple times, but he never faced real discipline. Supervisors failed to recognize or address the obvious pattern. That failure of leadership allowed Webb to continue until he finally targeted someone who couldn't be intimidated into silence and who had the legal expertise and authority to fight back. More victims started coming forward. Once the news broke, people who had been harassed by Webb for no good reason found their voices. 23 people came forward over the next 2 weeks. A Black nurse who was questioned about why she was in a high-security area when she was simply eating lunch on a bench outside a federal courthouse. A Black teenager who was detained for loitering while waiting for his mother who worked in a federal building. A Black pastor who was accused of trespassing while attending a public event at a federal park. An elderly Black woman who was searched after Webb claimed her purse looked suspicious as she entered a Social Security office. The stories went on, painting a picture of systematic racial profiling that had been ignored for nearly 2 decades. Patricia gave one carefully prepared statement to the press 3 days after the incident. She was measured and professional, exactly what you would expect from someone in her position. She explained that she didn't want to be the face of this story, but she felt obligated to speak out. If this can happen to a federal judge, someone with power, resources, and legal expertise, imagine what happens every day to ordinary citizens who don't have those advantages, she said. This is not about me. This is about a broken system that allows racial profiling to continue unchecked. She talked about the fear and humiliation she felt, even with all her credentials and training. I knew my rights, I knew the law, and I was still powerless in that moment. I was still treated as less than human because of the color of my skin. The interview resonated because Patricia didn't perform outrage or demand revenge. She simply told the truth and called for systemic change that would protect everyone, not just federal judges on beach towels. 48 hours after the incident, the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General opened a formal investigation into Marcus Webb and the Federal Protective Service's handling of his previous complaints. 12 days later, federal charges were filed against Webb personally. The United States Attorney for the District of South Carolina reviewed the case and filed charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Secr 242, false imprisonment, and filing a false official report. The deprivation of rights charge was particularly serious. It's a federal civil rights violation that carries up to 1 year in prison for cases without bodily injury, and the enhancement for filing false reports added additional exposure. If convicted on all counts, Webb was looking at up to 3 years in federal prison and a $25,000 fine. Webb's lawyer tried to argue that he had a reasonable suspicion Patricia was trespassing and was simply doing his job enforcing federal property regulations. That argument collapsed immediately when prosecutors presented a map showing that the beach location was clearly public property with no federal restrictions, and that Webb's own training materials explicitly stated that public beaches in the area were outside federal jurisdiction unless specifically posted otherwise. He tried to argue that Patricia's refusal to immediately comply with his orders justified the detention. Prosecutors destroyed that argument by showing the body camera footage and witness videos, which clearly demonstrated that Patricia had been calm, cooperative, and legally informed throughout the encounter, repeatedly asking for legal justification that Webb never provided. The trial lasted 8 days. The courtroom was packed every single day, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. 7 witnesses testified to being similarly profiled by Webb over the years. A use of force expert testified that Webb's aggressive approach and intimidation tactics were not consistent with federal law enforcement training. A constitutional law professor explained how Webb's actions violated clearly established Fourth Amendment rights. The woman who live-streamed the incident testified about what she witnessed. Her video played for the jury multiple times. The statistical evidence was devastating. Analysis of Webb's detention records over 17 years showed he detained black individuals at 11 times the rate he detained white individuals in similar circumstances. He requested identification from black beachgoers at 16 times the rate he requested it from white beachgoers in the same locations. The evidence was overwhelming. If you've made it this far, you're part of the solution. Subscribe and share this story so more people see what accountability actually looks like. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours, guilty on all 3 counts. Webb showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his wife broke down crying in the courtroom gallery. The man who had spent 17 years as a federal agent would now become a convicted felon. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge acknowledged Webb's years of public service but emphasized that his betrayal of the oath he took was too serious to overlook and that his pattern of discriminatory conduct had caused immeasurable harm. 22 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release after that, a $75,000 fine, 200 hours of community service at organizations serving communities of color, a permanent prohibition from working in any law enforcement capacity anywhere in the United States, and a requirement to participate in a documentary film about racial profiling that would be used for training federal agents. For someone who had built his entire identity around being a federal agent, this represented the complete destruction of his life as he knew it. His federal pension was reduced by 40% due to the felony conviction. His law enforcement credentials were permanently revoked. His reputation was destroyed forever. All because he allowed his prejudices to override his training, his common sense, and the Constitution he swore to uphold. Separately, Patricia filed a civil lawsuit against Marcus Webb personally, Jennifer Kowalski, the Federal Protective Service, and the Department of Homeland Security for civil rights violations, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent supervision. The lawsuit detailed not just the beach incident but the pattern of complaints against Webb that had been ignored for nearly 2 decades. It documented the Federal Protective Service's failure to properly investigate complaints, failure to discipline officers with clear patterns of misconduct, and failure to implement adequate training and oversight systems. The case never went to trial. 8 months after filing, the Department of Justice agreed to settle. $12.3 million in compensatory damages to Patricia Morrison, $17.4 million in punitive damages. Total settlement, $29.7 million. The settlement also included mandatory reforms, new bias training for all Federal Protective Service personnel, an independent review board for all discrimination complaints, body camera requirements for all public interactions, and quarterly audits of detention and search patterns to identify potential profiling, $29.7 million for 36 minutes of illegal detention. But it was never really about the money. It was about sending a message that racial profiling by federal agents would carry real consequences, and that ignoring patterns of discriminatory conduct would cost taxpayers millions. Marcus Webb was terminated from the Federal Protective Service 6 days after his guilty verdict. His federal law enforcement credentials were permanently revoked, meaning he could never work in law enforcement, security, or any related field again anywhere in the country. He was 49 years old and had spent his entire adult life in federal service. Now he would have to find a new career and explain to every potential employer why his name appeared in national news articles about racial profiling and civil rights violations. He tried to find work as a private security consultant. No legitimate firm would hire him. His conviction and the publicity made him unemployable in the security industry. His personal life suffered too. His marriage ended in divorce 16 months after the incident, the stress and shame proving too much for the relationship to survive. His 2 adult children gave interviews expressing their embarrassment and disappointment. One publicly changed her last name to distance herself from her father's actions. These weren't things Patricia wished on him, but they were the natural consequences of his choices and his years of discriminatory conduct. The incident triggered a comprehensive review of the entire Federal Protective Service. The Department of Homeland Security Inspector General's investigation revealed systemic problems with complaint handling, inadequate supervision, and a culture that prioritized protecting officers over protecting civil rights. The review resulted in major organizational changes. All 13,500 Federal Protective Service personnel were required to complete enhanced bias training and constitutional law refresher courses. A new civilian oversight board was created to review all discrimination complaints. Body cameras became mandatory for all public interactions, with footage automatically flagged for review when certain trigger words or extended detentions occurred. Quarterly statistical analysis of all stops, detentions, and searches to identify officers with concerning patterns. Supervisors held accountable for failing to address pattern complaints, with 3 supervisors in Webb's chain of command receiving written reprimands and reassignment. The entire Federal Protective Service was placed under Department of Justice monitoring for 5 years to ensure compliance with the reforms. 17 officers across the country were investigated based on information that came out during Webb's trial and the Inspector General's review. 9 were fired for similar patterns of discriminatory conduct. 5 were suspended without pay. 3 faced criminal charges. Agent Jennifer Kowalski, who had been present during Patricia's detention, was suspended for 30 days without pay for failing to intervene when she recognized the stop was problematic. She was required to complete additional training and was reassigned to administrative duties. Her personnel file would permanently note her failure to prevent civil rights violations, effectively ending any chance of promotion. The 2 backup agents, Santos and Hansen, received written commendations for their professional handling of a difficult situation and their attempts to de-escalate once they arrived. Patricia returned to her work on the bench. She didn't seek ongoing media attention or try to become a professional activist. She had a job to do, and she continued doing it with the same excellence and dedication she had always shown. But her case had an impact far beyond her personal experience. Law enforcement agencies across the country began using the incident in training programs about implicit bias, constitutional rights, and the consequences of racial profiling. It became a case study in what not to do, used by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, and dozens of state and local police academies. The Congressional Black Caucus cited her case in hearings about federal law enforcement accountability. 2 pieces of federal legislation were introduced that referenced the Morrison incident in their supporting materials, both aimed at strengthening oversight of federal law enforcement and creating stronger consequences for civil rights violations. Patricia quietly donated the entire $29.7 million settlement to organizations working on criminal justice reform, civil rights litigation, and legal aid for people of color facing discrimination. She established the Morrison Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, which provides free legal representation to individuals who experience racial profiling but lack the resources to fight back. She didn't want glory or recognition. She wanted to ensure that what happened to her would lead to meaningful change for others. The story of what happened on Driftwood Beach that Saturday afternoon is not just about one racist federal agent or one illegal detention. It's about accountability, about the power of evidence and witnesses, and about what happens when people refuse to accept that discrimination is just the way things are. It's about the fact that racial profiling doesn't care about your credentials, your accomplishments, or your position. A federal judge with decades of distinguished service still wasn't safe from being targeted, humiliated, and illegally detained simply because of the color of her skin. That reality was uncomfortable for many people to accept, but accepting it was necessary for any real change to occur. Patricia Morrison never said she wanted to become a symbol or a test case for civil rights enforcement. She was simply trying to enjoy a peaceful Saturday afternoon at the beach when she was confronted and detained without legal justification. But her experience became proof for the country about what accountability should look like when federal agents violate constitutional rights. Her legal expertise, her composure under pressure, and her refusal to let the incident be swept under the rug like so many previous complaints against Webb demonstrated what justice can look like when victims have the knowledge and resources to fight back. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember these lessons. Document everything. Use your phone to record video and audio if you're in a public space. Get witness contact information. Know your rights. You have the right to ask if you're being detained. You have the right to ask for legal justification for searches and seizures. You have the right to record public officials performing their duties. Stay calm. Do not give anyone an excuse to escalate. Patricia's composure throughout the encounter protected her both physically and legally. Follow up formally. File official complaints through proper channels. Don't accept verbal assurances that we'll look into it. Get everything in writing. Get legal help. Contact civil rights organizations, legal aid societies, or private attorneys who specialize in constitutional law. Many will work on contingency or pro bono for clear civil rights violations. And remember that you're not fighting just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Every complaint filed, every lawsuit pursued, every pattern documented makes it harder for discriminatory conduct to continue unchecked. Marcus Webb made a choice that day in May. He saw a black woman sitting peacefully on a beach towel and decided she didn't belong there. He thought he had the power and she had none. He thought he could intimidate her, humiliate her, and violate her rights without facing any consequences. He was wrong. And that mistake cost him his career, his freedom, his reputation, and helped trigger reforms that affected an entire federal agency while sending a message that echoed through law enforcement agencies across the nation. Justice isn't always swift or certain or guaranteed, but sometimes when brave people fight for it, when the evidence is clear, when witnesses refuse to stay silent, and when those with power refuse to accept discrimination as normal, justice does come. And that's exactly what happened here. Thank you for watching until the end. If you learned something from this story, or if it made you think differently about accountability in law enforcement, leave a comment below and share this video so others can see what real consequences look like. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories about justice, karma, and people who stood up when it mattered most. What was the most shocking part of this story to you? Was it the $29.7 million settlement, the pattern of 19 previous complaints that were ignored, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below.